one of the things I learned as I was in Beijing and involved heavily with AmCham China is that it's much easier to talk about the past or maybe the present. Talking about the future, even if you're talking about the next 100 days, is a much more challenging task. So I'm very glad to be moderating this evening and being able to rely on my colleagues on this panel to actually talk about the future, what is going to happen in U.S.-China relations under the Biden administration. We have three speakers tonight. They are Dr. Susan Shirk, who is professor and chairperson of the 21st Century China Center at the University of California at San Diego, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and well known as both as an academic and as a diplomat for her work on U.S.-China relations. The second is Ambassador Frank Lavin, who is presently CEO of a company called Export Now, which helps U.S. companies export to China using e-commerce platforms. He is former ambassador to Singapore and formerly Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. And third, Dr. David Finkelstein, who is vice president at the Center for Naval Analysis and the director of their division for China and Indo-Pacific security. David is a retired military officer and I guess the representative of the strategic community in our conversations this evening. Among the three of them are probably the strongest panel I've ever been involved with on U.S.-China relations. They've been deeply involved and are still deeply involved in the policy community from a diplomatic and business and military point of view. And I think we're very fortunate to be able to draw on their remarks this evening. Each of them will talk for about 10 minutes, and then we will have some conversation among the panelists and finally turn to a Q&A from the audience. And I thank you for all of the questions that were sent in advance. Those of you who have other questions that you want to add as we go along can put them in the Q&A function. And finally, I would just like to thank AmCham China and the U.S. China Education Trust for organizing the event this evening. Julia Chang-Block will conclude the program with remarks when we get to the end. And now I'll turn it over to Susan Shirk.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to Julia and to these two great organizations for giving us the opportunity to talk about U.S.-China relations tonight. I am feeling quite hopeful, optimistic about the prospects for U.S.-China relations right now. We have a new administration, and I think this administration will take a more practical and a more effective approach to the management of relations with China, to this very challenging time in U.S.-China relations, in which our relationship has deteriorated very severely to the point that we really are at risk of having a completely hostile and confrontational relationship, which is very dangerous and could really lead us to blow one another up. I mean, it's very, very dangerous possibility. So the Biden administration, if you want to know what the Biden administration hopes to achieve vis-a-vis China, what their strategy is, I suggest you read the article that Jake Sullivan, the new national security advisor, wrote together with Kurt Campbell. It's in Foreign Affairs, published a month or so ago, about how we could have competition without catastrophe. And it lays it out in great detail, and it's a vision that I think makes a lot of sense. It's a smart competition, but of course, there will be a difficult political environment in the United States, and there'll be plenty of people ready to leap upon them and say that they've become too soft on China, they're appeasing China, whatever. So really, we face not just a foreign policy challenge, but we face a domestic political challenge in steering a steady and effective course to compete effectively but peacefully with China. Now, why is this so challenging, the domestic part? It's because we have a very polarized politics, and one of the few points of consensus is an increasingly negative view of China. And of course, it's China's own behavior, both domestic and international, that is the primary cause for that very negative view. But what that means is that since it's the one area of consensus, that there'll be a temptation to build bilateral unity on domestic issues and domestic investments, especially anything that requires spending money, on the need to compete with China. So that dynamic in which a Democratic Senate, Congress, and White House will be tempted, I think, to try to bring the Republicans on board by building on this consensus of how we really need to show China that, in fact, America is not on the decline. We have a lot of resilience, and we are a strong country economically, technologically, militarily, our infrastructure, educationally. So we have a lot of work to do to strengthen ourselves. And I think that China, a kind of anti-China orientation, could become the focal point for that bipartisan consensus. Some of that is good because we really need to do the hard work of getting our own house in order. But if we take it too far, it may actually get us to the point in which we are handling China in a more aggressive way than we really should to be effective. The other big challenge that I see is that the Biden administration has said from the beginning of the campaign that we're not going to go it alone. The way the Trump administration did. We need to work with allies. We need to cooperate with other countries, which is a recognition that China's leverage, especially its economic leverage, has really increased, and America's has diminished to a certain extent, or certainly not kept up with the pace of China's progress. So yes, of course, we want to work with our allies, but as we have seen recently in the negotiation of the China-European investment treaty on the eve of the new administration, that our allies don't have quite the same interests that the United States does. And they have different interests. They're much less concerned about the security risks of interactions with China than the United States is. They're focused very much on their commercial interests. They care a lot about human rights issues, as Americans do as well, but their interests are not quite the same. So working together with our allies and friends to have a kind of common approach to China is not going to be a simple matter. And it's going to make for a much more complex China policy effort, which really is because these other countries will be very important part of the process. We're going to have, it won't be so much a bipolar structure as a multipolar one. But recently I heard from a Korean expert, South Korean expert, who made the point that the alliance with the United States is kind of useless in the face of China's economic coercion. And so much of the pressure from China is China's economic coercion. So it is a big challenge to figure out how, say, Australia's friends and allies can work together to try to help Australia, which is right now standing up to this economic coercion from China. So I'd say these are interesting new challenges that the Biden administration will face. And then finally, of course, really so much depends on whether or not China's leadership recognizes that this really could be the last chance to stabilize relations with the United States before they really go off the cliff. And do they have the wisdom, the pragmatic gene to make the compromises that they need to make in order to engage in some useful, practical give and take with the United States at this critical moment? And, I see some encouraging signs, but I see some discouraging signs. One very discouraging sign was the pretty stupid sanctioning of Trump administration officials right as the Biden administration came into office, which suggests that the Chinese leadership and their advisors do not understand American politics very well. So I'm going to leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And we'll turn to Frank Lavin.
Thank you, Chris. And I want to echo Susan's thanks to AmCham and thanks to USET and Julia Cheng-Block, who's here with us today. So it's great to be back. I remember it took me back when I was started as a commerce DAS under Bush 41. We'd always back brief AmCham Beijing after our negotiating rounds. I kept that up when I came back to Commerce as undersecretary, but it was terrific. Really good interaction. Always good to get feedback from the Beijingers because these folks are the practitioners, and they every day have to contend with trade barriers or problems or something the U.S. government might be doing wrong, something the Chinese government might be doing wrong. So I'm glad to be back chatting with AmCham Beijing again, and also with the whole USET community. Look, I found myself in general agreement with Susan's points, but let me try to tackle some of these issues from a trade and economic perspective. And I was just jotting down notes in preparation for these remarks. I said, look, it's very hard, as Chris said right up front, it's very hard to predict what is actually going to take place. But let me delineate some of the constraints on movement, on positive movement, and some of the enablers of positive movement, right? And we'll see how this plays out. But something for us to bear in mind is I think the number one constraint on trade resolution or improvement in trade relations is just management bandwidth. And I mean in the US, that you've got a new administration, the new president has two burning issues, keeping economic growth on track and getting his hands around coronavirus. And these are two pass-fail tests that he's got to tackle both of these. He's got to tackle both of them immediately. And how he tackles these two issues will define his administration. So he has capacity for other issues. And he's got it in the international affairs, international outreach is part of it, no doubt. But I'm saying how much political capital he will invest in trade, per se, is going to be finite. It's going to be capped. and there's just limited appetite, limited ability to move. So that's somewhat cautious starting point. Point one is just manage the bandwidth. Point two is there is a limited upside to trade in the U.S., meaning there's limited political upside. You do it right, you do it well, you improve something, you fix something. There's not necessarily a lot of applause. So there's a limited constituency for trade, right? It's something that all U.S. presidents over 70, 80 years, past president being the exception, had a commitment to doing some kind of trade improvement and removing barriers. I'm sure President Biden shares that, but I think he also says that it's a limited win. If we have a win, it's not what's going to set the stage for successful presidency. But I think the main constraint are the themes that I found myself echoing, are the themes that Susan articulated, which is, look, this is a down moment in the bilateral relationship. The primacy of the geopolitical issues really put a limit on what kind of flexibility the U.S. has or China has on trade. There's not a lot of trust or goodwill in the bilateral relationship. I would say in both countries, the constituency that is skeptical or perhaps even hostile outweighs the constituency that favors engagement. So it's not that the issues dominate. Issues always tend to dominate, but it's that there seems to be now, somewhat surprisingly, on both sides, there seems to be an absence of any kind of positive voice. That there doesn't seem to be any senior statesman in either Beijing or Washington saying, look, a stable bilateral relationship is in both countries' interests, and both countries should have systemic value in trying to solve problems and should not be taking shots at the other country. So some kind of engagement and problem-solving approach is necessary for both countries to move ahead. But I don't hear that voice. And I'd say finally, on the constraint side, all societies sort of have this ongoing policy debate between economic nationalism and economic rationalism. I get the sense that is with the political transition in the U.S. is tilting a little bit away from economic nationalism, a little bit more toward rationalism, which lends itself to movement on trade. But I get the sense the opposite is kind of unfolding in China, that China is increasingly of the belief of saying, look, we've kind of improved on market economics. We've got state-directed economic decisions where it's important, market economics where it affects people's everyday life. But we have a very limited appetite for trade reform. We don't necessarily see an open trading system as a desired goal. In fact, in my experience in China, China was almost a standalone in its attitude toward trade negotiation. It would engage and there'd be outcome and there'd be improvement. But my sense of it was that the government of China didn't see market rationalism as a worthy goal in itself, but it saw maybe incremental problem solving as a useful goal. It saw engagement as a goal, but the trade movement tended to be somewhat grudging and tended to be somewhat minimalist. So I'm not optimistic about a lot of movement on the China side. Now, let me take all of these strands together and talk about possible outcomes this year. I hope, despite what I articulated as constraints, I'm sorry, before I get to talk about the enablers, I talk about the constraints, let me talk about the enablers. One big enabler of trade is what Susan articulated. There's an improvement in tone from the U.S. We have a president who is, I would say, a policy rationalist, who is just looking for ways to move the policy debate ahead. So that's a very important building block. Second, I think both sides do understand that at base there is merit in trade. Trade can be win-win. Of all of the, telephone book of issues between the U.S. and China, trade lends itself more easily to a win-win dynamic. Third, I think China might not be a strong believer in market rationalism or improving trade for its own sake, but I think they are a little bit sensitive to decoupling argument and the need to say this argument, this school has greater currency in the U.S. and in Europe, and to lean against that a bit, to push back against that a bit by coming up with some compensatory mechanisms that would make it easier to do business in China would be useful for China and China's own interest. And the final comment I'd make as an enabler is if there's a TPP move, what used to be called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I still call the TPP. But if U.S. signals, and remember, in a sense, Biden was an author or a co-author of this initiative because it was the Obama administration that brought it to fruition, and then it died during the 2016 campaign. If Biden brings that back to life, I think that does serve as an indirect nudge to China to maybe be a little more forward leaning on trade. So those are sort of the enabling dynamics. I think how this comes out, I think it depends on what we're going to see this year. I think a lot of it depends on what kind of attitude or appetite we might see in Washington or Beijing. If Washington, I've argued, for example, that what Biden needs to do is remove all of the tariffs that Trump imposed. I think these are just counterproductive, and it sends a terrible signal to Beijing, right? You're injecting friction and cost into a relationship, but you're not achieving anything. So if Biden has the appetite, he's a little bit hemmed in because there's a domestic constituency in the U.S. that likes it. There's a friction-oriented constituency, so he doesn't have maybe complete latitude. But I'd say he probably has the latitude to declare in the next 90 days that some parts of these tariffs are outdated, or the purpose has been served, or something else is happening, and so we're going to remove 10% or 20% of the tariffs and see if China does something in kind, which I hope they would take that up on that. So he has, I think, the ability to test the waters on removing some of the tariffs. I also think China has some latitude too. China, as Susan said, you've got a new administration now, you've got a change in tone. There's an opportunity for China to send some positive signals. It doesn't have to respond to the US. They can be global or MFN type signals, but China could say, we're going to go to zero tariffs on all medical equipment, medical devices, biotech, pharmaceutical products. We're just going to unilaterally move on trade because it's for our own good. It's not a concession or a favor to other people, but it helps our society. Similarly, China can make a similar statement on green tech or clean energy, that we're going to go to zero tariffs on all alternative energy inputs, right? Again, this is for China's benefit, not as a favor or concession to other parties. So the steps China could take that I think would well received, it would at least put into the debate some positive music that China does have an appetite for moving on trade. It is willing to move toward market norms to global norms, and that the US should view China as a worthy interlocutor on trade. So I think just getting some positive momentum, positive signals would be the first order of business. And I hope we can get something in the next 3 to 6 months where we see both sides take some baby steps on trade that at least get that positive dynamic going again. So that's my overview. I look forward to a discussion.
Thank you very much. And we'll turn to David Finkelstein. I think you need to unmute.
Okay, there we go. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be with such distinguished colleagues to present some personal views. I will start by positing that going forward, the military dimensions of U.S. China relations on the military side are going to witness more continuity than change, I think, despite the advent of a new administration. Undoubtedly, the public rhetoric will be adjusted. A new national security and national defense strategy will be promulgated. And I absolutely agree with Susan that we can look forward to a more practical and effective approach to U.S.-China relations. Nevertheless, the confirmation hearings this week of Tony Blinken and Avril Haines underscore that there is widespread agreement that certainly on the defense and security front, China poses a long-term challenge that has to be met and has to be managed. Now, going forward, we will see continuing military competition between the two defense establishments, but accompanied by attempts by both sides to manage the associated risks. So what I want to do is maybe talk about what this competition on the military side is about, and then talk about the risk mitigation, so we have a good picture. So to begin with, this military competition is really, of course, an extension of rising strategic distrust between the two countries in other arenas. Moreover, the military competition did not start with the Trump administration or even with Xi Jinping, although the policies of both those leaders have exacerbated the situation. Truth be told, for those of us who travel in defense circles, we've been watching this military friction build for over 20 years by now. And I like to say that the military competition with China manifests itself in 6 dimensions. They are strategic, operational, geographic, technological, military, diplomatic, and informational. Let me just go through each of those very quickly. So strategically, since the Hu Jintao years and accelerating under Xi, Beijing's conception of why China needs a strong military has undergone a fundamental shift. Added to the traditional missions of defending the party and the PRC's physical security, Beijing seeks a PLA that can underwrite Beijing's aspirations to great power status, that can defend and secure its economic interests far beyond its shores, and a military force that can undergird PRC's status as a regional hegemon, buttressing its regional economic clout. And what's also unprecedented in Chinese history is that this has entailed the modernization of the Chinese Navy as a credible instrument of military force projection, certainly within the Indo-Pacific region. So taken together at the strategic level, these developments have unnerved many countries in the region and pose a de facto challenge to the US. So that's strategic. Operationally, this competition is fundamentally a contest between two doctrinal or operational visions, where the US seeks to ensure that the American military can continue to deploy, move, and strike over great distances unimpeded. The Chinese, for their part, have an operational vision that sees that no potentially hostile military, especially the US, can operate in the vicinity of the PRC with impunity. And if it does so, it takes on great risk. Geographically, the military competition, of course, is the most intense in the Indo-Pacific. It's in this theater more than any other where the possibility of a conflict, a kinetic engagement, or an unintended military incident is acknowledged by both sides. And of course, PRC forces are most efficacious in this theater since they operate under the umbrella of all of their land-based assets. So in the future, the potential for U.S. China military competition to become increasingly global cannot be discounted, depending upon where and with whom the PLA decides to exercise or establish more bases, or how the PRC chooses to employ military force to secure its expanding overseas interests, as witnessed by some clauses in the recent National Defense Law amendments that passed just a few weeks ago. Technologically, both sides are using the other as the pacing threat for their military modernization, and they're looking to develop high technology to degrade each other's advantages. Technologies such as hypersonics, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, and the use and denial of outer space, cyberspace, and the electromagnetic spectrum. Fifth, the military diplomatic competition is underway, with each side promoting its own vision for an appropriate security architecture in the Pacific. And in this military competition, we're touching many of the countries in the region. And Susan brought this up when she talked about the challenges the US is going to have in dealing with allies and partners. The US is going to be looking to strengthen its alliances and partnerships, while Beijing attempts to exploit differences between the US and its allies, raise the price for partnership with the US, and offer its own alternative architectural visions. And then finally, this informational dimension, where each defense establishment is using all available means of strategic communications to advance its own narrative of its intentions, its roles and capabilities, and paint the other military's intentions as well. Last year's battle for the narrative of the military dimensions of COVID-19 waged by the PLA, I think, is going to be the stuff of doctoral dissertations for years to come, perhaps. So these 6 dimensions of military competition are going to persist going forward, and this is what the Biden administration is going to inherit. But let me also turn to the other half of this dynamic, which is managing risk. Although both militaries think about the possibility of conflict, because that's what militaries do, frankly, my own assessment is that neither the Pentagon nor the PLA, or the US or PRC political leadership for that matter, is anxious for a conflict. Certainly not a conflict resulting from an accident, unintended escalation, or misunderstood strategic signaling. In other words, neither side wants to stumble into a war. Especially with both militaries operating increasingly in proximity of each other in the maritime and aerospace domains, and with the PLA conducting military operations in the vicinity of Taiwan to increase pressure on Taipei, both sides recognize that the operational risks of an accident are exponentially increasing. And it's for this reason that the US side has been insisting on making risk reduction, risk management, and crisis communications the centerpiece of relations with the PLA. This it will persist under a Biden administration. I can't imagine that it would not. And for their part, the PLA is also quite worried that an unintended incident could escalate out of control. My own interactions with the PLA over the course of 2020 witnessed remarkably heightened concern on their part about the prospects for an accident going kinetic. So they're pretty worried about this also. So the question that the two sides perpetually work on is how best to use the current venues to mitigate risk. So I think what the Biden administration is going to have to do in the Pentagon is take a look at all of the different venues that the Pentagon and the PLA have in place to mitigate risk, to enhance crisis communications, and engage in confidence building measures, and make decisions about what they need to keep, what they need to enhance, what they need to discard, and what new venues have to be put in place. For their part, just as Frank said and Susan said, this is an opportunity for the Chinese side to do the right thing, to quote Spike Lee. I would be hoping, and I would strongly suggest, were they listening tonight, that the PLA side make clear through word and deed to their incoming US interlocutors at DOD that they are determined to work cooperatively to mitigate risk, even as their military modernization plans move forward, which they will. And I know, and I'm very confident, that the Biden crew that's coming in is thinking very hard about how to manage all of this risk. So to sum up, on the military side of the relationship, I see two trends after January 20th. The first is continued military competition across the 6 areas I discussed. And the second is the search between the two sides for better ways to mitigate risk and reduce strategic and operational miscalculation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, all three of you. That was extremely interesting. I kept waiting as I listened to all three of you for the word Taiwan, which finally came up in David's remarks to some extent. But I wonder if any of you would care to address a little more in a little more detail the place of Taiwan in U.S. China relations as we move into the Biden administration. Yes, Susan.
Well, I was interested to see and not surprised to see in the article by Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell that they advocated for maintaining the status quo in cross-strait relations. And they even went so far as to say that a lot of the tacit adjustments that the United States, Taiwan government, and China have made over many decades to maintain stability in the Taiwan Strait and to enable Taiwan to prosper, to develop as it has, might even serve as a model for how we manage regional relations in Asia with China and the United States and other regional players. So I think I notice that Beacom Xiao did come to the swearing in of the president, which is a step toward a kind of symbolic step of recognizing her position in Washington as a kind of quasi-ambassador of Taiwan, which is a bit surprising because it's one of those symbolic steps that I would think maybe the Biden administration wouldn't make. But I think by and large, they will try to maintain the status quo as best they can.
David, do you agree?
Well, yes, I think that what is the status quo? And the status quo is no conflict, no confrontation over Taiwan, and that Taiwan is able to maintain its de facto status as an independent entity from Beijing. And certainly, I think that's what the administration would want. I think that's what any administration, almost any administration, would want. But there have been a lot of changes over the past 4 years under the Trump administration and how this government deals with Taiwan and what this government is willing to do with Taiwan. The appetite for risk over Taiwan was very different than previous administrations, and especially with former Secretary Pompeo issuing his drive-by policy change on what contacts with Taiwan or how they're supposed to take place, how he undid those. I think that the crew coming in is going to have to look very hard at all the things that have been done with Taiwan that are public and all the things that are not public, probably, that we've been doing with Taiwan, and figure out what they want to keep and what they need to roll back. And so I suspect that a Taiwan policy review will be part of any larger Indo-Pacific review that Kurt and others are going to be undoubtedly conducting in the next few weeks. Over.
Frank, you had a point?
Sorry, had to unmute. Thanks. Yeah, listen, I think we've got a kind of consensus here, but let me just highlight an area where I be a standalone. I favor all sorts of economic engagement with Taiwan, and I've written about a U.S. Taiwan free trade agreement, so I'm all for that side of things. I think, and I don't mind in general the Trump administration improving connectivity. That is a general construct, that's fine. But I think I would caution friends in Washington, be very careful about the degree or the modality of political connectivity. I thought the attempt to send a UN ambassador was a mistake. I think that was misplaced because Taiwan has no formal UN identity, and nor should it. And that even comes close. I don't think it did. It even comes close. It certainly goes against the spirit of the Shanghai Communique. So I would not have recommended that. And I'll say, look, I certainly all for inviting B. Kim Xiao to the inauguration. I think what's interesting to note in every story I've read about that, there's no evidence that she was invited in as a member of the diplomatic corps or that she was seated or treated as a member of the diplomatic corps, simply that she went there. She was invited and she went, and here's a selfie. I think that's perfectly fine. I would not support ascribing to the Taiwan rep in the United States diplomatic status or political status or treating her as a member of the diplomatic corps. You know, I think she's a wonderful person and I'm happy to have her invited to whatever she fits into. So I might have some distinctions there philosophically with my colleagues on this panel.
And the reason for that is you want to uphold the recognition of the one China policy in the Shanghai Communique.
Yeah, my view is, look, that's a formal political commitment. That's a treaty obligation of the United States that we should respect. And I would say it brings a lot of stability to the relationship, and it gives leeway for all sorts of educational exchanges, health activity. I think Taiwan should be a member of WHO. As I said, a free trade agreement. There's all sorts of things we could do to improve relations with Taiwan, but I wouldn't ascribe political status to Taiwan.
Okay. Another word I was waiting to hear but didn't from any of you was India. What role does India play, particularly nowadays when you have a border conflict in the Himalaya region between India and China, and you have a context of American interest in building a greater sort of Indo-Pacific strategic relationship with India?
Well, India is another major power in the region, and the Biden administration is continuing to use the concept of the Indo-Pacific, and I think will be thinking about the region in terms that very much include India. And I would expect to see a lot of diplomatic effort invested in relations with India.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly on the defense and security side, Chris, courting India goes back to the Clinton administration, trying to go back almost 20 years to get the Indians to stop waffling on the fence and realize, as successive administrations would have it, that their future is with future democracies such as the U.S. And so what's now in place, this, I don't know if you're familiar with the Quadrilateral Security Agreement, the Quad, the U.S, Australia, Japan, and India, that has made some interesting strides over the past year. For the first time, the Indians allowed Australia to take part in the annual exercise called Malabar. So for the first time, you had the four militaries exercising together: Japan, the U.S, Australia, and the U.S. And you can, and I'm not, this is probably a good thing from an American perspective, but you could probably imagine, for our friends in China who see the acorn but imagine the oak tree, what the Quad looks like from their perspective. And in all the conferences and discussions I've been in with friends in the PLA, or interlocutors, as Kurt would say, they are wired out of their minds that the U.S. is going to turn that into a larger anti-China alliance. So India has a strong, we should have great relations with India as a technological innovator, as a place where we need to do trade. We have a lot of political simpatico with their system, although Modi has an interesting twist on Indian democracy, right? We know. And there are defense interests there. So I can't imagine that this administration would not be further trying to deepen all the areas of cooperation and integration with India.
Okay, do the three of you have any questions you want to ask another speaker, perhaps, or comments you want to make? If not, I'll go on to some other things, but I thought I'd give you an opportunity. Yeah.
So responding to Frank's comments about TPP, and I see that someone asked a question in the Q&A about it too. It was, to me, a very big deal that Xi Jinping came out and said that China had an interest in taking steps it would need to take in order to join the new version of TPP. I mean, that was really a bombshell. And many people thought it was cheap talk. Many people said, and in fact, the questionnaire in the audience here said, isn't it pretty well impossible for China to meet the qualifications to become part of this very high quality trade agreement that addresses all sorts of issues, including labor, rule of law, other elements that would be very state-owned enterprises, very difficult for China to meet that standard. And yet, maybe it is cheap talk, but we do have Malaysia, we have Vietnam, we have other state-owned enterprises, other communist countries, Vietnam. So, maybe they could do it. And certainly back in 2015, a task force that I co-chair, we recommended, this is before the Trump administration came in, we recommended that the United States work together with China to develop a roadmap to step by step do what it would have to do to join TPP. But now the United States has declined to join. And what I hear from folks in Congress is don't even think about it, that there's no support for America joining TPP. and that it would be a kind of waste of political capital for the Biden administration to try to persuade Congress that it's a good thing. And so we actually face the possibility of China sitting down with, say, Japan and negotiating a gradual roadmap to join TPP while the US sits outside. So the interesting question then is whether or not this need to compete effectively with China might cause some of these folks in Congress, not now, but maybe in 2 years, 3 years, to kind of hold their noses and think about, okay, the United States really has to join. But then if they say, well, we'll join, but we have to renegotiate it, but China is actually quite a ways along in talking to Japan and others about joining, renegotiating will be extremely difficult.
Mhm.
Yes,
Absolutely
Frank, I
agree.
thought your enabling and restricting factors sort of led to the same conclusion that if something like this happens, it'll be 2 or 3 years from now, not any time in the near future. But what's your view on TPP?
Yeah, well, Biden can claim authorship. He does have a legacy there, and there's a faction of, say, the Obama loyalist Democrats that I think would be supportive. At the same time, this blew up in the 2016 campaign because Bernie Sanders came out against it. And then Hillary Clinton said, well, I've got to come out against it too. And then Donald Trump said, I was against it all along. So there was a very powerful sort of populist upsurge in 2016, and it died. I don't think it's out of the question it comes back to life, but it's what kind of effort does Biden want to make? And by the way, it might be China's moves that spur the U.S. This was always part of our trade negotiations, always part of NAFTA was, do we want political stability in Mexico? Always part of the Central America free trade is, let's try to bolster democratic institutions there. So it, again, part of U.S. regional footprint to say, do we really want to cede the role of trade leadership to China and give China a seat at the table when we're walking away from the table? So it might be China's moves that form an inducement for the U.S. to put up its hand again. I would say this, I'm very glad Kirk Campbell's been selected to lead the Asia programming. I think we have a very serious Asia hand. I would advise the administration, spend the first few months in consultations with our friends, allies, trading partner, get to India, get to Japan, go through Southeast Asia, and have those discussions about what they'd like to see from the U.S., where the U.S. could fit in, make a contribution, what we'd like to see from our friends as well. And then I think at the end of a few months, we'll be in a position to answer Susan's question. I think the appetite might be more than 2 or 3 years. It was interesting to me that the revamped NAFTA agreement, that USMACA, borrowed from the TPP digital language and put that in place, and that went through very handily. It was also interesting to me that the U.S. did a side agreement with Japan on digital that was out of the TPP, taken from the TPP. So there's already sort of validated and vetted TPP elements within U.S. trade framework at present. So I don't think it's a long dated move. And if, let's say this, no U.S. president has ever been denied a trade initiative. If the U.S. president goes on national television and says our country needs to do this, I think he's going to find Congress supporting him. It's a question of political capital, and does he want to allocate that kind of time and effort to this type of project?
Mhm.
I'll just underscore the obvious and state that it was strategically obtuse of the United States not to be part of TPP. I do think that a lot of our allies and friends and others would like us to come back into TPP, but I think the negotiations are going to be a lot tougher for the U.S. to get re-entry into it.
Yep, I think that's true. We haven't mentioned also climate change, which, as you recall, at the end of the Obama administration was one of the few areas where there was quite a bit of talk about U.S. China cooperation, technologically and also in other ways. Do any of you see any prospect for working together on climate change in the current environment?
Yeah.
I'm a skeptic.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm more optimistic about that, and of course we'll see how Kerry's going to handle that. When I think about how to deal with China, I think about the three C's, which is compete, confront, and cooperate. Compete means doing what we need to do at home and abroad to make ourselves more competitive, so that we can at least be on the same playing field with the Chinese. And a lot of that means domestic investment and things right here at home. Confronting the Chinese when they engage in policies or actions that are deleterious to our interests, but also cooperate when it's in our selfish interest to do so with the Chinese. And it just seems like a no-brainer that climate change is one of those areas.
Susan, you're nodding.
I'm sure there'll be a major effort, but it will not be linked to other facets of the relationship. I mean, one mistake that people think the Obama administration made was linking climate cooperation, which of course was a kind of high point of working with China in the Obama administration, with other dimensions of the relationship. And the Chinese side does tend to try to get leverage by saying, well, we'll do this almost like it's a favor for the United States. And then you've got to do something else for us. But of course, it's in the interests of everybody who lives on this planet that China and the United States work together on climate change. So I don't think you're going to see any linkage of that sort.
Mm-hmm. One of the several of the questions that came in before this evening and that are also in the chat now go to the question of how sustainable and how realistic the possibility is of any kind of major negotiated settlement with China, given the fact that the U.S. has very strong views on human rights, which China regards as interference in their internal sovereign affairs. And on the other hand, the U.S. has just published or not published, but just recently declassified an Indo-Pacific strategy document, which appears to want to deny Chinese leadership in its own region. Given if we start out with those kinds of very basic and fundamental mutual challenges, what are the prospects for coming to an agreement, and what are the prospects that any agreement one could come to could be sustained?
Well, anybody else want to talk about? I mean, human rights, the Xinjiang and Hong Kong issues are, very, very important. And the Xi Jinping government has very much overreached in its kind of police state treatment of Xinjiang. And now I think there's a very strong consensus that this policy is a policy of genocide, trying to wipe out a whole group of people, large group of people, and not just, and in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong moves are a kind of Beijing occupation of Hong Kong. It's very extreme, and it's created a tremendous backlash, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. So I think the United States and the Biden administration will try to cooperate on climate and on public health. They'll try to negotiate pragmatically on issues, high priority issues, including those related to the economy and technology and other things. And they will really push back very hard on issues related to Xinjiang and Hong Kong.
No, I agree. I don't think this is an administration that's going to hold its nose and turn the other way. Certainly not with the constituencies that it has, who are concerned about these issues, as they should be, and the bipartisan consensus in the Congress that some of China's actions have been egregious on the human rights front. So this is not going to go away. But the other thing to be said is that the Chinese get a vote also. It's not just about what the Biden administration is going to do and how the Biden administration is going to handle this. Xi Jinping and the party get a vote. And as Susan said earlier, I think it was Susan, hopefully they have some perception that this could be their last chance to help do their part to reset this relationship on a steady path. And what you read, I don't have to tell your constituents who are out there in the audience. You live this every day. But the Chinese approach to this is that we want better relations. They're bad now. You Americans fix it, and let us know when you do. Right. So putting the onus on the U.S. to make everything better is a recipe for nothing to happen.
Frank, how do you see this impacting the business environment and trade issues?
Yeah, look, I don't think it's realistic, and I wouldn't advise anybody in the U.S. to seek a grand bargain or a grand strategic deal with China. Just quite a huge difference in political systems and aspirations and cultural differences. And I don't say it's not necessary. It's not a question of how much can we meet and talk through our differences. I think what all that's realistic in the near term is, can we at least find a few areas where we can improve, get some positive messaging going, so we're not on an open-ended sort of secular deterioration. I mean, it's the problem with injecting friction in a we're just leaving an administration that used friction as a management tool, and it's one contribution to the process was add friction. I'd say that's using tariffs to guide your trade policy is like using your car horn to steer your car. I mean, it can be helpful in very isolated incidents, but as a standard operating procedure, it fatigues the system. You're just attaching a cost to the overall relationship, and it's a nuisance factor as well. And so we've there's been deterioration for other reasons, but I'm saying that the tariffs contributed to that. So I'd say if we just can remove that thorn, we'd be better off. So I mean, it's almost a little bit analogous to some of the Middle East issues, meaning the issues are very, very complicated, long-dated issues. Probably some of it's intractable, but if we could at least solve some of these things, fix some of these things, at least you're injecting some positive mood to the discussion and restoring business confidence and allowing people to feel better overall about the bilateral relationship. We're at risk. I mean, this is how Susan kicked it off. We're at risk of just a secular, self-perpetuating erosion of the relationship, right? There's no floor under it at present. So somebody's got to reestablish that floor to allow good news to take place.
So that suggests that we try to find relatively discrete areas where there's a mutual benefit to negotiating an agreement.
I'd say baby steps in some minor areas would be great. Look, I mean, you asked a minute ago about Taiwan. Maybe this is maybe China's already doing this because you don't always telegraph what you do. If I were in the Beijing and the Chinese foreign ministry, I would say we're going to go through Taiwan's tariff schedule, and I want to make sure mainland China has a equal or improved tariff line in every single vis-a-vis Taiwan. I don't want Taiwan on any segment of the economy to be more inviting to foreign businesses than we are in China. We view this as a strategic necessity. So they could unilaterally improve their business operating environment and they don't have to make a public speech about it, but just on a secular basis, take some steps ahead and improve it. And that's for national security reasons, right? Not a concession to any other party.
Mm-hmm. When do we expect Xi Jinping and President Biden to meet? Is there any expectation or anything on the calendar where they would likely be together?
I don't know, when are the next
Cambodia, right?
APEC, G20,
G7,
G7?
G20.
So it would probably occur in that kind of a group environment rather than a bilateral meeting, in your view?
Well, I don't know, but I certainly hope that.
My guess is Biden's sorry, I was gonna say Biden, by his own personal pedigrees, he's a Europeanist. And he was always the guy that went to Verkunda to go to the European security conferences. And that's his personal orientation. I would expect, leaving aside Canada and Mexico, I'd expect his first personal journey to be to Europe.
Okay. He does have a history of having spent a lot of time with President Xi when they were both vice presidents.
I think
Yeah.
that the 2013 trip was, I think it was quite a long one for the vice president at the time.
Mhm.
But I think they really want the optics anyway to be not to rush to engage directly and bilaterally with China, but to shore up the rest of our diplomatic relations and then move on to China.
There's a lot of discussions with a lot of allies and partners that have to take place about China policy before Xi and Biden meet.
Right.
So we're months away from even thinking about it, I would suspect. Of course, I could be wrong, but that would be my guess right now.
Okay, thank you very much. So in that kind of context where we have a constraints on the speed with which the U.S. side or the Chinese side is going to turn to improving the bilateral relationship, what about the people-to-people side? What can be done by educational exchange, people-to-people diplomacy, whatever? Anything significant, or do we
Well,
just
I've got
keep-
to say that both governments, the previous administration and the Chinese government, have managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in one area where we did have good things going on. The Chinese have made China a very unwelcoming place for a lot of NGOs, and the previous administration did the same thing for Chinese right here. So I see a terrific and potential role for people to people, but the atmospherics have been very much poisoned. Susan, what do you think about that?
Well, I really hope that the Biden administration signals to the Chinese side that this is one area in which they really need to either unilaterally or in a negotiated way show that they're serious about stabilizing the relationship. And that includes journalists, and that includes a lot of the restrictions on academic exchange. But a lot of that work, lifting of things, has to come from the US side. A lot of the visa restrictions that have so alienated folks in China, so alienated Chinese at our universities, that really has to be done by the Biden administration. I hope it will be one of those early moves that will open up. I mean, now, of course, COVID also makes it difficult because people are not traveling back and forth, and especially China with its kind of total control approach to COVID, which has been very effective. But what it means is that basically no international travel.
Well, so in many ways, then maybe perhaps, Susan, COVID is buying both sides some time to negotiate what a future people-to-people world looks like.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it also speaks to the whole question of the Winter Olympics. Where one of the people in the Q&A asked about the Winter Olympics. And the Winter Olympics, I think, will be a target, especially for pressure on Xinjiang, as well as Hong Kong. But I remember the decision of the Carter administration to have our athletes boycott the Olympics, which I think in retrospect was a bad idea.
I think many of us would agree with you there.
Yeah.
But the topic will probably come up again.
It will. And I think it's because there are so few levers we have to really put pressure on the Chinese government for its egregious treatment of Muslims in Xinjiang and of people in Hong Kong. And so we turn to these very high profile symbolic things, which I think it's really because we have so few other levers to use.
Since you've answered one of the questions in the Q&A, I think maybe we just transition to looking at the questions that we have in front of us that have come in. One of them is addressed to Professor Finkelstein, and that is, through what means will the US and the Chinese military enter into some kind of a professional relationship to mitigate risk? And I wonder if you would comment on the recent Chinese decision to skip a pre-scheduled meeting. Whose fault was it that that meeting didn't happen?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, it is a major source of irony that of all the institutions in both China and the US that are engaged in this relationship, it's the two militaries over the last 4 years that have possibly been working the hardest to keep the lid on something awful from happening. There already is in place a very wide-ranging set of dialogues, venues, and confidence-building measures between the two militaries that provide them the opportunity to work out their problems, whether it's the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement since 1998, which the Chinese took a pass on back in November, the Defense Policy Coordination talks at the DASD level, the defense policy talks at the undersecretary level, and you can talk about the various communications means that have been used between military commanders to talk to each other. I mean, there are quite a few means out there for these two militaries to be talking to each other. And I would also say that back in November, the Chinese Army and ground forces and the US Army went ahead with their annual disaster management relief exercise, where over the past few years, they rotate between the US and China. We've actually had Chinese boots on the ground in Hawaii and Fort Lewis, and the US Army has been in Nanjing and other places. They did it virtually this year, but despite all of the folderol going on in other dimensions of the relationship, they still went ahead and did that because both militaries understand that not to contain their frictions could be absolutely catastrophic. So the question is, can we make those venues better? That's the question. And on the question of the Chinese not showing up at the MMCA, I certainly don't have any informed inside information that would help enlighten what's going on. But it didn't help anything not to show up.
Okay. Frank, there was a question for you on tariffs, and that is if the Biden administration unilaterally takes them off, will that be seen in China as the US blinking first and as a Chinese win?
Yeah, by the way, Chris, that's certainly a risk, and there's also a risk it'll be seen that way in the US. It'll be seen as some kind of repudiation of a hard line in the US or so I wouldn't recommend that as a one-off. I would recommend a testing. Take some of them and test and see, and there'll be a legitimate basis for saying, look, some of these tariffs might have made sense 18 months ago or 36 months ago, but the past due at this point, so we're going to relax this, we're going to leave some of these tariffs and see if you get a response from China on that goodwill gesture. So take a baby step, test the market a bit, and see if China's smart, as my colleagues panel said, if they're wise, they will also say we need to generate some goodwill, get some positive momentum going on it. But I think it would be a mistake to Biden just to declare tomorrow the tariffs are gone, because it would be a major unilateral concession. And also he'd paint himself in a corner domestically in the US, which I don't think he needs to do.
Yeah, I really don't think that friends in China understand the degree to which some of their domestic and foreign policies have created such resistance among very many constituencies that have a stake in this relationship. And that's not to say that we're not without fault. There's plenty of blame to go around. Many of the policies we've lived through for the past 4 years have not been as smart as they could have been. But, you know, John Pomfret wrote this great article from John Pomfret, Washington Post. He asked the rhetorical question, who lost America?
Yeah.
Just as we asked the question in 1949, who lost China? The Chinese need to be asking themselves, as John Pomfret put it, who lost America?
Right.
So, you know, if you're into selling stuff to the Chinese, sell them a bunch of mirrors.
One of the questions here is, will the Biden administration restart the U.S. China strategic and economic dialogue or some similar sort of dialogue? Is shaking your head, so I presume you have a view.
Yeah, my bet is no. There will be dialogues, there will be negotiations, but I don't think you're going to have this elaborate show of dialogue, which really was not very effective. So they'll do something different. They will not do that.
I'm with Susan. Let me elaborate on that. I think U.S. way overinvested. I think the apotheosis was the sort of Hank Paulson construct of, you know, the more people, literally 300 people in a room. And I think this played to all of the weaknesses in the U.S. system and all the weaknesses in the China system, that the more you overload the agenda for the grand bargain, the less likely anything comes out of it. Whereas if you would just come down to some sectoral level initiatives for, you know, God knows what, auto safety or anything, you know, tire safety or something, you would have probably had some bankable improvements in it. So I would say, don't make grandiose, large scale meetings. And I'd make another point too. Think of this as the restaurant program, the restaurant problem, game theory, the restaurant problem, meaning you're running 10 restaurants and one of them's losing money. So where do you put your efforts? And without any more background than that, you'd be tempted to say, well, of course, on the one that's losing money. But you'd say, no, you should put your resources based on what kind of return you're going to get on those resources. It might be investing in weakest performer. It might be investing in the strongest performer. The point is, this is what was a backbone of U.S. trade policy for 80 years, was the restaurant problem, meaning don't define your resource allocation on the basis of the problem. Don't do it. And it really changed under Hank Paulson, and then it really changed under Trump to say, no, let's put our resources disproportionately against the biggest problem, not against the biggest opportunity. But I would tell anybody in the Biden administration, where can we gain ground? We might be able to gain ground with a US-EU free trade agreement. We might be able to go back to the TPP. There's going to be a standalone US-UK trade agreement. The Trump administration, believe it or not, started negotiations with Kenya, which is small potatoes, but why not? So the point is, allocate your resources against opportunity. Don't allocate your resources against problems.
Okay, that's an interesting principle.
Yeah. I'd also point out that the so-called 4 big dialogues that Xi and Trump put into place were equally useless, if not more so. The other thing that seems to be missing, and maybe the Trump administration had it and I just didn't see it, but a serious back channel at the highest levels. I mean, a Donilin Daibingguo type of back channel at a serious level that I'm not sure that they had in the previous administration, or at least I didn't see it.
I don't think there was such a thing either. What do you think about technology and tech policy? Are we going to continue the kind of conflicts we've had over Huawei and other companies? TikTok is sort of a pending, still to be resolved question. What do you think the prospects are for academic cooperation in the technology area between the U.S. and China?
Well, again, I think the Biden administration will take a more pragmatic, practical approach to this. And on Huawei and 5G, they will work hard to support open source technologies that will be an alternative to Huawei. You know, the Huawei issue is really about the Huawei base stations, which are really just 4G with a little faster. This is not what 5G is really all about. And the United States has a lot of technological assets that it can, especially with a little bit of government help in terms of procurement standards and support for building the 5G standards by our firms, we can compete very effectively. So I think the Biden administration will take a much more practical approach. I think it's great that they have a new senior director at the National Security Council who is in charge of technology and security. And this will help coordinate and harmonize the policies of different executive branch agencies in a way that will, I just think, be much more effective and a lot more predictability. So our researchers, our firms will all have a clearer idea of what they can do collaboratively and what they can't do collaboratively. And it will mean that the areas of security risk they're going to deal with a lot of risk management, risk mitigation, rather than just wholesale saying don't collaborate with China.
Yeah.
So I think it's just gonna work a whole lot better and put us in a very strong position to compete with China.
At the same time, it's difficult to countenance that the enhanced CFIUS-FIRMA processes that are in place are going to be rolled back any because of the national security dimensions of technology and dual use.
Yeah, I think they will certainly be maintained. We had a question from Tom Gold, which is what do we know about the status of China's American experts, especially those who studied in the US? Are they trusted? Are they influential? And related to that, he asks that what we should ask Yang Jiechi when he speaks at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations on February 1st. So if you have some questions you want posed to Yang Jiechi, you can put them before this audience.
Hi, Tom.
Well, I think there is a bit of a debate in China right now about how the Chinese government should deal with the new Biden administration, and some of the America experts are proposing a pragmatic approach that recognizes this is a real moment of opportunity. And, so, however, does any of this have any influence on Xi Jinping? In this kind of personalistic, more dictatorial type of system that has been established under Xi Jinping, it's really hard to know whether or not he listens to anybody, frankly. And that's why this type of regime is really quite, dangerous potentially, because it's got a very narrow base, and we don't really know. And David said this earlier, whether or not he just is bound and determined to take advantage of American weakness. I don't believe that Xi Jinping himself has a very nuanced, sophisticated understanding of the United States, and I don't think he has any particular goodwill for the United States.
It strikes me, Susan, that we could take that description of a government dominated by one individual's attitudes and put the word Trump in and apply it to the last 4 years in the United States. And that raises the question, in the Biden administration, have we now moved beyond that? I mean, for example, can we expect the revival of an interagency process directed by the National Security Council? Can we expect a more professional and predictable U.S. government?
Yes.
Well, I certainly think so. I mean, I think you're going to have, I think you're going to have U.S. engaging with other powers along traditional lines, meaning let's try to shape a convergence of interests. Let's draw on goodwill. Let's engage in give and take. And that's typically how we work with allies and friends. Now, China is a special case because there's never been that goodwill or never been that terribly strong convergence of interest. But in general, it means the U.S., I think, will be back on the front foot diplomatically. And if we look at the State Department team and the NSC team, it's a good team. It's a professional group of experienced government hands who I think can play to that strength of America as being America should always try to be the preferred partner, the preferred interlocutor, the worthy friend of our trading partners and our allies. I think we'll see that reshaped again with Biden.
Okay. We've had several questions about Australia and the extent to which the U.S. might support Australia in its current difficulty with China. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts on that matter.
Well, I've been buying as much Australian wine as I can find.
But Dave, I saw you, your body language when I was speaking about alliances not being much help in dealing with economic coercion. It seemed to me that you disagreed with what I said about alliances not being that much help with China's economic coercion. Do you have some good ideas about how we could be better friends to Australia right now?
Well, so I'm not sure that I disagreed with you, despite my body language, whatever it was. But I don't know. I didn't know that we weren't being a better friend to Australia. I think we've been helping them quite a bit, at least on the defense and security side. On the economic side, I don't know.
But what I mean is, it's just really hard. I've been trying to read everything I can on China's economic coercion, and people are suggesting, let's create a fund, to help them, not just Australia, but Korea when it was punished, or the Philippines, or Norway, or whoever. But it doesn't look like it would really make that much difference, so.
No, I hadn't heard of that.
We're certainly not going to be able to buy a lot of coal. I'm drinking a lot of Max's Chardonnay, which is a Penfolds brand, and I recommend it to anybody who wants to buy Australian. We need to wind up, and we're due to stop in 5 minutes at 9:30. But before we do, I'd like to turn the floor over to Ambassador Block from USCET for some concluding remarks. Julia.
Thank you so much, Chris. Well, hello, everyone. Well, we've come to the conclusion, the end of our Live from Washington election program. And I want to thank AmCham China, the speakers. What a discussion we've had tonight. And all those of you who have joined us, not only for this webinar, but for the others as well in the series. I see many returnees. I have to say that I think you would agree with me that we have, or this series has depicted one of the most unforgettable and tumultuous year in American electoral politics. It must be said because it didn't come up in our discussion. But January 6th will live in infamy as the day when then President of the United States, Donald Trump, incited an assault against the U.S. Capitol. The storming of the center and symbol of American democracy by Trump supporters, however, did not stop the U.S. Congress from executing their constitutional duty of certifying the electoral victory of Joe Biden as president and Kamala Harris as vice president. This has a lot to do with the series. You might be asking, why bring it up? Well, even Trump, while still disavowing the results, recognized that, and I quote, there will be an orderly transition. The inauguration on January 20th proved him right and redeemed the hallmark of American democracy, the orderly transition of power. I hope this USET and AmCham series has been true to the facts and presented America's more than 230 uninterrupted years of democratic rule, warts and all, just like tonight's discussion. Catastrophe has been averted, but what have Americans learned of what brought us to this ignominious point? I think we are reminded and must remember that words matter and that the language and actions of our leaders have the power of life and death. And not only in America, but we are living through a period of democratic recession around the world. So what does this mean for the U.S. China relationship, the Biden administration, and U.S. China Education Trust? It means our work is needed more than ever. The U.S. China relationship is too important, I think, to fail. Everyone is watching, the world is watching. The images of January 6th have been seared into global consciousness. Lest the world loses hope for America, my immigrant experience, for which my parents sacrificed so much and for which I benefited so much, tells me that the American spirit will not relent until the country emerges from the chaos and learns from it and improves. Let me just quickly conclude this program by quoting President George W. Bush when he spoke at Tsinghua University in 2002. I still remember that day. And I quote, "Life in America shows that liberty paired with law is not to be feared. In a free society, diversity is not disorder, debate is not strife, and dissent is not revolution." Thank you all very much. And I hope we can invite you all again to another program sponsored by USET and AmCham China. Good night, everyone, or good morning, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Have a good day, have a good evening. And you guys, speakers, moderator, you were just terrific. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Julia. Thank you, Chris. Thank
Yeah.
you, Susan. Thank you, Dave. It was great.
Yeah.
It was really a fun panel. Really, really great. Great questions. Thanks so much.
Enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. Thank
Right.
you.
Bye-bye.